Okay, so I'd like to just explain what this panel is about and where the ideogenesis of the panel came from, and then I'm going to hand over to the speakers to give some short presentations about themselves and their work, and then it's actually going to be a kind of roundtable discussion panel rather than more longer traditional papers. So I'm the co-director of Man Met Game Centre with Paul. If you don't know who I am, I'm Chloe. Kirsty, who's on the screen there, is a colleague of ours at Man Met University in the English department. Also, and maybe better known as Kiley Dunbar, a very successful romance fiction writer. And the three of us together have been talking about over the past few weeks about and months about romance in games, gamification of romance and romance narratives. And we're kind of working on this nascent research project. And we thought it would be really interesting to bring together some of the creators and designers into the conversation to talk about some of the ideas that we've been interested in as researchers. So I'm really pleased to welcome two more people to the panel. And the first is Emily Cairboss, an indie role-playing game designer and publisher, who's a foundational member of The Forge and an early leader in the indie role-playing game movement in the States, and is considered to be the creator of the American free-form genre of role-playing games. We've invited Emily today for her work on indie role-playing games, but particularly, I'm going to bring it up here, this work, which is a selection of RPGs and a LARP that are all about romance and relationships, and really fascinating piece of work that we've been enjoying reading. You can see from all the post-it notes I've got stuck in there how interesting I've been finding that. So thank you to Emily for joining us. And our other speaker today, and I'm going to drag this across as well, is Jacob Jaskov, who's the designer of, can we see this? Fog of Love game. It's a bit blurry, but which Michael Heron spoke about earlier, which is a really interesting social game, collaborative board game with role-playing elements that is about role-playing a romantic comedy between two people. That's a really fascinating game. So we're really interested to talk about these games today and the idea of romance and games. So I'm going to invite each speaker to give a brief introduction about themselves and their work, and then a little bit about these specific games and books that they've been working on. And then I'm going to chair a discussion where we've got some questions we've been thinking about as a panel together. And then there'll be a little bit of time at the end of that for some audience questions as well. So I will hand over, if I can, first to Kiley for quickly, well, before her delivery of books arrives.
Okay, thank you. How can everybody hear me okay? Hi, everybody. Oh, it's lovely to be invited along today. I'm very much a beginner in the world of games. Oh my goodness, I'm learning a lot. It's such a steep learning curve. Usually when I turn up to talk at an event, or even sometimes when I'm in my own classroom and I'm teaching students on the creative writing programme at Manchester Met's writing school, I often have to begin my classes with a kind of a bit of a diatribe about how romance needs to be taken more seriously in the academy, how it's something that we should be reading critically, and that we should be enjoying and reading just in the same way that we read literary fiction. And I feel like I don't actually need to do that today, because when Paul and Chloe invited me to be involved with the Game Centre, I instantly got online and I said, I'm about to get super interested in romantic games. Does anybody want to talk to me about it? I was expecting most people to ignore me, and I got loads of replies. And it turns out that I think games people are very friendly indeed. And I've had lots of invitations to play, and I'm just very grateful. So thank you for your openness. I write novels like this. I'm holding up my, this is probably my bestseller book. Oops, it's called The Borrow a Bookshop Holiday. And it's a pastel cover. You know what you're getting. It's in that visual idiom of these are British commercial pop fiction, pop romance. You can tell that because it's pink and blue. And it's got a young white woman standing in the foreground in front of a cozy tumble-down bookshop. And of course, it's set by the seaside, and it's a summer book. Romances are always split between summer and winter markets. Summer offering, I write 2 a year, 1 summer, 1 Christmas. This is I've written 7 now. Listening to this morning's discussions, I was really struck by the similarities and parallels between romance and game design, game playing, and reception of games, inclusivity, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a bit. But it's really struck me how romance is in a state of change, and has been since about 2016, when everything changed. And I think romance has had to have a really hard look at itself, and the institutions sort of gatekeep romance, the publishing houses and big bodies like the RWA, the RNA. They're looking at at how inclusive we are to broad readerships, and that's something I'd love to we can talk about that a little bit later in this panel, because at the heart of my writing, I want to make my readers happy. I want to make them feel, literally, I want to make them feel happy, I want to make them cry, and I want to make them feel the spark of attraction and sexiness, if that's what they're there for. And so I'd love to talk about that and how you do that in a kind and inclusive way. So that's enough for me. I'll stop.
Thank you so much for that, Kirsty. And I don't know, would you prefer to refer to yourself as Kirsty?
Both. I've got my red lipstick on, so I'm Kylie today. I'm on brand.
You're slipping in and out of role. That's fine. That's good. That's appropriate for today. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Emily now to introduce herself and her work.
Thanks so much, Chloe. And it's wonderful to hear about your work, Kirsty. I'm looking forward to learning more. My name is Emily Care-Boss. I live in the United States, in Massachusetts, and I am a tabletop and LARP role-playing game designer. I am here because my first game that I published, and then several others, are romance themed, and it has sort of put me in that box, which is wonderful and also sometimes irritating to just be put in that box. But when I began designing, it's about 2005 that I published Breaking the Ice, which is one of the 3 games that Chloe so nicely showed earlier. I don't have a copy of myself right this with me, so thank you for sharing that. And all those post-it notes made me so happy to see. That means it's been used and played and enjoyed. And let's see. So for me, role-playing is something that is really close to my heart, and I really look at it as an art that has brought a lot to my life, and that I enjoy and really place in the spectrum of the literary arts of humanity. And a lot of times people don't take games very seriously, or they sort of put it in a little box about it's for children, or it should have certain qualities. You know, it should have this type of experience that people get out of it, and nothing else is like appropriate or acceptable. So I really love pushing out of that and trying to think about ways that we can just think about the narratives that we're embodying and sharing and collaboratively making. And it's wonderful to bring romance into that. In the gaming community that I was a part of in the United States, primarily tabletop in I got into role playing in the 90s, and then did more talk with people in the 2000s on the forum that Chloe mentioned, the Forge, indierpgs.com, which was one of a couple of places where people were sort of thinking about games in a more cohesive way. For me, romance was just like, why wouldn't we have that be part of this experience? I love those narratives. I have found myself using romance books as a way to escape from the world at various points in my life. First of which was when I graduated from college and just, fell onto the bed at home and just, dissolved while I was decompressing from all of that pressure. And, there were romance books for me to like get from a wonderful little bookstore and, you know, chow through. And later when I started writing games, for me, it was very natural to have that be part of the narrative stuff that I would want to bring in. And so I put together this tiny little game. I was like, oh, it's just a 2-player game. And that should be a nice place to start design. And it was romance, and people were a little horrified. Like I literally had some people more horrified about that than cannibalism. I had a player say, this is very nice and all, but I'll go back to my safe little cannibalism game over there because romance is too scary. And so it was a really real learning experience for me to just like put it out there, and both have people really resonate with it and love it, and reject it outright. You know, for some really good reasons. This is too sensitive. You know, the earlier panel talking about all the stuff that comes up in the LARPs that people were designing, and the amazing mechanisms that we have today to try and help communicate and support and be there for one another are all really necessary. And so I was just like dipping my toe in and having all the reactions that people would have to that. So let's see, don't want to go into it much longer. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff for us to talk about, but that's sort of how I got into writing romance-themed role-playing games. And I'm really grateful to be here in this space and this time now where Kirsty can reach out and have lots of people say, yes, come play my game that has love and romance in it. That is like a wonderful turn of events. That is delightful and so freeing. And so it's great to be able to be on this panel and chat about it now.
Thanks so much, Emily. And then I'll hand over to Jacob, who can introduce his work on Fog of Love.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So Fog of Love is a game. It's my first game I designed, and it's a game I designed for a specific audience. That was my wife. So we are divorced now, but at that time we are together. And I wanted to create a game that we could enjoy together. My background, professional background, is within the innovation and design. So I invent new things, always with a user perspective. So I'm always like, I'm used to listening to users, to the recipients of what I design, and listen to their needs rather than just doing what I want. Of course, it's a game I wanted to design to play with my wife, so it was also a thing I wanted to do, but it was also something I wanted to do that could interest her. And the reason for that was that at that time, that was in 2012, 13, 14, most board games at that time were like, and still are, of themes that are like everything else than romance or personal relationships, drama. It's about a lot about external conflict. It's about combat, about conquest. It's about bluffing or money optimization, running a company or something like that. And it's interesting. And she also liked it, but after a while she grew tired of all this because it was always on my terms, because I like these other themes. I like the other games. So she felt it was on my terms, but nothing for her. And it's like when we, for example, share Netflix and watch TV, sometimes she chooses, sometimes I could choose. And then back and forth. And then it was okay to see what I wanted, because she knew that she could also watch what she likes. But it wasn't possible within games because there were no. And I did a lot of research. I'm a researcher by heart, so I studied the big database of Board Game Geek. What other games are there that could be interesting in any way? And I could, out of around at that time 80,000 games in the database, I could find 20 or 30 that somehow had a theme that had to do with life or relationships or love, but that was just on the surface, because when you played them, there was still the feeling of the games was still combative and nothing like romance. So I wanted to do that, and that was basically how I started with all this. And then I began to research, because that's what I'm doing. I began to read a lot of books about romance and what characterizes romance and what are the structures behind it, also behind love and relationships. Because if you want to create a game that can be played again and again, you need to have a structural basis. So what are the structures behind this that I could use? But also what are then the kinds of conflicts, or what is the drama that is interesting? Because we need to have a game, and a game without drama or something that is difficult, then it's not a game, it's just it's something else. So I wanted to find out what could be then gamified here. That's also one of the topics I think we're going to talk about. What can be gamified within love? How can it feel like a game? What is the challenge here? And of course, the challenge is not to fight each other. that's not the interesting thing. It's not who wins over each other. But then it's something else. It's about finding the right person and finding out, are you the right person for me or not? And also hoping that the other person finds that I'm the right person for him or her. And so it's about a mutual attraction, but also about a mutual discovery and some choices, and then also making it work together. So it feels it's a different feeling. And of course, then I wanted to research and design something that feels like this. So that was basically how I came into this. And since then, of course, I've designed the game, but also then dabbled into other kinds of designs. And I can see that one of the big things that is missing within games, especially board games, is something that has to do with inner conflict. Because most games, or all other games, are about outer conflict. So if you look into like the action genres, or also some of the other genres that are out there versus literary fiction. So literary fiction is very much focused on internal conflict. It's about the inner aspects of the person and being fulfilled as a person, versus fighting somebody else or something else, or saving the world, or whatever it is. And all games are about fighting someone or something, and not about discovering yourself. So that's what I've been interested in when I designed Father Love, and also what I'm studying now and seeing what else can be done.
Thank you so much for those great introductions. And it's what you've talked about there, this kind of trying to design something that didn't really exist particularly in board games. Maybe it was kind of there to some extent in role-playing games a little bit more, but certainly not in board games. And I've been researching recently, trying to get my hands on anything that's kind of explicitly romance themed in board games. And there's kind of Fog of Love, and there's Marrying Mr. Darcy, which is another good one, but also very combative, and not really much else. So my first question for the panel really is about those two spaces, the kind of game space on the one hand and romance on the other, those two cultures. So as you've just said, games, particularly board games and the Euro game and the American kind of fantasy and war games, are often characterized by conflict. And indeed, most board games and a lot of role-playing games genealogically can be traced back to the tradition of wargaming from the 70s. So, I kind of want the panel to reflect on the effect of bringing romance narratives, culture of romance and romance into these spaces. But also play hasn't been only about conflict, war games and combat, although that has been a dominant history. It's also been a potential space for exploring relationships. Paul mentions in some notes we've been making about the Victorian flirtation cards that provided excuses for flirtatious interactions in kind of Victorian parlor games, but also more modern games such as Twister, which create kind of opportunities for touching that is, perhaps, there's a space there for exploring relationships that's not allowed when you're not playing the game. So games haven't always been about war games, I suppose, is the point there. So my question for the panel is, what's the effect of bringing romance into games, and was that potential perhaps already there?
Good question. So my experience within board games is that people have a lot of expectations, and usually they are very afraid of this. So people say, okay, it's interesting, but isn't it dangerous to play because you can ruin your relationship? That was also what Michael alluded to early on, that he has heard about this. So, and this is the first thing. everyone asks me about. When I started playtesting, and also later on, that's the first thing. And people ask this in a like funny manner, haha, but isn't it a bit dangerous? So they are actually afraid, because everyone asks it in the same way. And I've also asked people then after they've tried it, so was it dangerous? How did it feel? No, it wasn't dangerous at all. So it felt normal, and by far the largest majority has had no like difficult challenges or problems with this. There was even one of the big reviewers within board games, Quinns from Shut Up and Sit Down. They are probably the biggest reviewers today. When he talked about it the first time, he said, "Oh, I would love to play it, but not with my partner, because that would be like having a picnic in a minefield." That was his phrase. So, and then this picnic in a minefield, that stuck, and everyone asked me, "Okay, is this like a picnic in a minefield?" And then later on, when I met Quinns and asked him, and he said, and he introduced me to his wife, who loves the game, and he said, "Okay, they're actually playing the game. So is it like a picnic in a minefield?" No, why do you say that? Why do you think that? Yeah, that's your phrase. Oh, I forgot. So everyone has this idea that it's dangerous to play romance and it can ruin things, but actually it's just good fun.
I think it's really interesting how that gets framed. And I had similar experiences, as I mentioned earlier, of people being very wary initially. And in role-playing games, I think the context, the social context has changed a lot. It's much more acceptable now. But we were coming from decades of play dominated by Dungeons and Dragons. And actually we're entering another decade dominated by Dungeons and Dragons, since it has such broader popular appeal now with streaming. But the social context then often was isolated groups of people who were a little bit socially awkward and outsiders, male-dominated, teen male-dominated, and the kinds of stories and behavior between the players was often very negative and female squashing. And so playing romance in that context, very, very touchy. Bad acting, bad player behavior towards each other. And so that was very understandable to me. But there are other games, the White Wolf set of games, Vampire, with LARP and Tabletop, I think really brought in a lot of different sensibilities. There's sort of a sexiness to vampires that's always there. Anybody else doing Dracula Daily? Oh my God, such a great review of that story. And it's wonderful to like read the book with all of Tumblr at the same time. And anyway, so there was a little bit more of that space that the game could come into. And now, obviously it's not universal. Nothing is monolithic, even though our hobby is so small. But there's just more room, there's more space, and there's more language around consent in people's lives. There's more awareness, hopefully, of abuses and how to avoid them. So I think the changing social context affects it very much. And it's really interesting thinking back about parlor games, and there's a term alibi that is used in particularly Nordic LARP circles to talk about, a game gives you an alibi to play pretend. Adults usually don't get allowed to do that, but if there's a structure and there's rules, then we can do that. And having the alibi of, oh, well, I'm just passing an orange from one friend to another. So it's a little bit fun to like be in contact with somebody else, and I'm going to play Twister, and oh yes, I fall on you, ha 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 ha. So it allows this room, and I think that's really what games are about, right? Play is this space where you get to play with reality, and you get to try something that maybe you're not good at, or maybe you aren't really, or you can learn to embody. And so that has so many places of value to be able to let yourself step into something or to try something out. And then the question is, how do we make sure that we don't overstep our boundaries with others? And that definitely has been an issue and something I've tried to attend to in the design that I do, and always, getting feedback from players about how, emergent dynamics can arise, and try and, respond to that is really important.
It's interesting, just before Kirsty comes in on this point about romance and games meeting, is Emily, you're talking about like the White Wolf games and the culture of RPGs maybe having a bit more space in it already for romance, because the history of romance novels is of course bound up with Gothic novels. My first degree and the first research area is in Gothic literature, now working games, but those two things, the history of Gothic literature and the history of romance literature are intricately bound. The first romance novels were Gothic novels, and I think White Wolf definitely has baked in from the beginning a Gothic romance, so it's really cool to hear you talk about those. And of course everyone, I mean, I'm a White Wolf player, I have been a White Wolf vampire player, and we all love it, the drama and the romance of it all. But I'll let Kirsty talk a little bit more about, from a writer's point of view. And I know, Kirsty, you've been reading some game books recently as you've been researching this stuff, so what you found about the space where maybe games and romance meet.
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose my role as a romance novel author is to be in play all the time with reader expectations, because romance readers tend to read many romances in a year, and real fans will read maybe 200-300 romances, just devouring romances, and so my job is to convince the reader that they're not going to get what they're expecting. So of course we're always expecting that rising action. Here's the conflict, there's the meeting, there's the conflict, there's a falling out, there's a dark moment. Are they going to get back together? And my job is to convince the reader that, well, no, not this time, actually. And and I love that sort of suspension of their understanding of those generic expectations, that allows the reader to feel, oh, it's not going to work this time. And of course, we always do get our happy ever after. And I was interested in that and how that works with games as well, because the definition of a romance in the across marketplaces is that it ends with a happy ever after, or a happy for now. It's fine too. And without that happy ever after, where the couple or the whatever many lovers are in your story, they're together, and you get to see what happiness looks like for them at the end. That's we have to have that in a romance, otherwise it's just a love story. Yeah? So I'm interested in that, and how, even though I read hundreds of romances a year, I still always think, oh my god, maybe this is the one where they're not going to be together at the end. And I like that about that. But I've been reading, you're right, Chloe, I read this one, it was Paul who recommended this to me. I'm holding up Star Rider, which I think lots of you might have read. It's by Carol Carrick, and it's a lovely choose your own romance. And I started this thinking, oh my goodness, I'd love to write one of these. Surely I can write a kind of branch narrative with lots of different versions of conflict, with lots of different versions of meet cutes, with lots of different options. And then as I read this, what I thought was going to be quite a simple, straightforward structure, I find it absolutely mind-blowing. And then I remembered, yes, I don't have a brain for games. I couldn't do it. It absolutely astonished me how I find this very sophisticated. And I think that's how a lot of people experience come to romances, isn't it? I think a lot of readers, even my own students, will come to romances. They'll turn up in my romance class, my genre fiction class, and think that they're going to read something that's they know what they're getting. It's going to be predictable. It's going to adhere to particular cliches, particular types of heterolinear logic, and then when we read contemporary romances, I think they're quite surprised by the complexity and the diversity that's currently just blossoming in our market. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to stop waffling and hand back to Chloe.
You're not waffling at all, Kirsty. Thank you for that. And it's great to get these different perspectives. And, you know, we've from different spaces. So I'm going to try and bring those together a little bit more even, and ask if you think there's something game-like about romance already before we bring it into a game space. And that could be romance, the fictional genre, or in quote marks, real romance. Is there something game-like about romance already? What does it mean to turn a love story? Or I really like that distinction, Kirsty, that you've made between romance and love story, actually. What does it mean to turn that into a game? Yeah, have you got any thoughts on that?
I can lean in here. Someone mentioned earlier that one of the board games about love was about Jane Austen or Pride and Prejudice. What is it? Finding Mr. Getting Mr. Darcy.
Marrying Mr. Darcy, which
Marrying Mr. Darcy.
Yeah. You get, if anyone doesn't know that game, you get to play one of the female. It's a card game. You get to play one of the female characters from the novel, and your aim is to play cards to get attributes so that the suitors will make a proposal, but you have to get the right suitor for you. So you get more points if you get the right suitor. At the same time, you can try and scupper other people's chances of getting their suitor by, you know, ruining their bonnets or spreading nasty rumors about them. Yeah.
A game that reminds me of from the role-playing game space is Good Society, which is a recent, really beautiful, well-done role-play game that has a similar theme. And that it's sort of a natural to go to Jane Austen when thinking of romance. You know, she's such an amazing writer in English, and people associate what she does with romance fiction. And there's game elements right there. There's the competition, there's the you know, having rivalries, having hopes and dreams, and there's arenas of play and conflict, you know, whether it's the home and the park, or it's Bath and balls and London coming out. And so I think that there's, you know, all you have to do really, and this is one of my contentions, that role-playing game design is narrative analysis. So all you have to do is look at what are the areas of engagement and conflict that are in the particular genre of romance that you're looking at, or setting, or period. And I guess what sets the sort of Regency, or, you know, that style of writing out is the competition element. That there are a limited number of these eligible partners, and you want to score them. And the people that you're going for are trying to score as well, thinking of like Sense and Sensibility, where we have these passionate young lovers in Marianne and Willoughby. And then you later find out that Willoughby was trying to score a good mate all along, and he gives in and he sells out. And so I definitely think that there's, you know, you're just trying to look at the stories and see where the elements of play, what the variables are, and what the rub is, and what the conflicts are, and then finding ways to put that into a game.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah, please do come in.
Yeah, so my take on that is, because that was also one of the like initial structures I work with, because it's an obvious one, the rivalry and who do you score, and to score the right one. But it very often, or very easily, becomes a transactional story that is not very deep and emotional, because you need to score the right one. So who maximizes? So it's a maximization exercise and competition exercise, and you begin to treat the others as objects rather than subjects. And I think what's really interesting with love stories and romance, but also other stories, is when people when the involved are subjects, and they are there with the full emotional scale and make choices that are deep. And I think here of course it's more difficult to gamify, but there are some things you can do. But it's a very different structure than the competition one, because then you need to disclose who am I as a person, and also figure out who am I and what do I actually want. And also change. So all good stories involve personal change and personal growth. So how can you have that as part of a game? So doing something that is against you, but then overcoming but this is something I then designed into Fog of Love, where you have personality traits, then you can change them. So initially you're following them, for trying to fulfill your personality traits, but as you go along, you find out that it's actually not possible. But then the game gives you the possibility to change, and it gives that later, at a later stage in the game. So people don't realize while they play, but there's a hidden structure behind it. So there's more and more change happening as it becomes more and more dramatic and difficult, and then suddenly things change, and you fit into the role that you want to be, and your partner does the same, and then you might end up with a beautiful relationship, and that doesn't feel transactional. It feels like we actually made a choice, we struggled, we fulfilled our needs, and we did this together. Or we didn't, because you can also be an asshole in the game, but that's also part of the game. So you need to figure out, is the other person someone I can trust or not? So there's definitely the trust issue. That's a deep thing, and of course something we know from real relationships. But this is also a thing you can gamify and play with.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's so true what you're saying about the elements of Fog of Love that are pushing you away from it being transactional or some kind of optimization kind of game into a much more complex game about emotional exchange and intersociality. Although when I played it with my friends at Games Expo a few years ago, I definitely was an asshole. So that was no, it didn't bring out the best in me, I have to say. Can I move on to Kirsty and ask her about this question around perhaps game-like elements already in romance as a genre?
Yeah, sure, that's lovely. I want to pick up very quickly on being the asshole. That's really interesting, because in romance novels, particularly with male-female, we're still allowed to, the male characters, the millionaire or the alpha hole, they're allowed to be badly behaved still in romances, but there's still a problem in contemporary romance with if there's the main character is a woman, there's this problem of likability at the moment, and I see reviews all the time saying a particularly messy main character in a romance was unlikable, so 3 stars or whatever. And maybe we need to, I think that's something that we need to address in contemporary romances, and allow our heroines to be problematic and a bit untidy, because the men have been getting away with it for years in romance. Anyway, so who wins in a romance novel? How do you win? How does the main character win? And Gwen Hayes has written a wonderful book called Romancing the Beat. It's Romancing the Beat, How to Write Kissing Books. Gwen Hayes argues that you have to take your character from the point at which we meet them, where they have a hole in their heart, something that they need, and take them to the point where they are at the end, where they are wholehearted and they're back together. And to win a romance novel now, I think earlier novels, so if I look at sort of big novels of the so quite early romance novels, often the acquisition of wealth or marrying well or is the answer, and an engagement ring or a baby at the end of the novel is the goal. And I think contemporary readers are getting less and less interested in that kind of destination point for a romance. So my heroines, my heroes, they what's most important for them is in their journey is that they know themselves at the end. And sometimes I leave I separate the couple at the end so they're not in the last scene together, so that we know that they're together and they're in love, but I want to see that person on their own, the person that we followed all the way through and that we've invested in, as a whole person on their own, that even though they're in love, if they were not with that person, they would be okay. And they've done the other stuff that they needed to fill that hole in their heart. Like they've saved the little, the museum or whatever it is that needed to do, that they've opened their bakery or whatever. I haven't written a bakery book or a museum book, but you know what I mean. So this is how we win at romance. And I think we're becoming less interested in all of those things that Jacob was talking about, that sort of acquisitional thing. We're less interested in bagging the Duke and bagging the millionaire, who are always very problematic anyway, aren't they? And we're a lot more interested in sort of in seeing our characters on their own 2 feet at the end, and sort of fully self-actualize.
Thank you, that's great. I've got lots of questions for the panel, but I'm going to ask one more from the ones that we've discussed, and then I'm going to go to some that are in the chat because they're quite interesting. So the last one is really about intimacy, and something I've been doing recently is playing games, not only games that are about romance, but games that provoke uncomfortable modes of intimacy. So there are some, there's a really interesting one called Inhuman Conditions, which is based on the Voight-Kampff test from Blade Runner, where one of you is playing the interviewer of the potential kind of robot, and the other person is playing the robot, maybe, or maybe they're a human, and you've got a set of kind of cards and you're trying to determine whether the other person's a robot. You're finding out their role, you're both role playing, you find it very personal information, creates really uncomfortable space of role-playing intimacy, but there's also game-like elements like, is the robot going to win? Is the human interviewer going to win? Are they actually two humans working together? It's really interesting. And other games like The Mind, which is a card game where no one can speak, and you have to place down numbered cards in order. So you get a hand of cards, and if you've got number 1, you can put it on the table. If someone's got number 4, they can put it on the table, number 20, but you're not allowed to speak. So you have to somehow like mind read, somehow in a kind of weirdly looking at each other in a weirdly intimate way as you put these cards down on the table. So really interested in the way in which games provoke, produce, encourage intimacy rather than conflict and aggression. And my question for the panel is, how do you see your role as a game designer, a game writer, or even a game, you might be the game master, the dungeon master, if you're in a role-playing game. What is your role in negotiating intimacy, and can that be difficult for you, for the readers, for the players?
That's a very good question. I think, so the examples you had with The Mind, it's one of my favorite games ever. It creates synchronicity. And I think that's also something I've explored in designs that I've like tried out now. How can you create this synchronicity? Because this becomes really, really intimate, and some people become really uncomfortable with this. So I've played it with one of our very good friends who said this is the worst experience he has had in his life. It was like he thought this is the most awful thing he had ever experienced. I was like, and he has experienced a lot of things, so it was too intimate for him. But I think of course it's about being explicit about what you're trying to achieve, what is this you're doing, and setting up and staging it properly. And I think you can do that, and this is happening everywhere in life. So if you're going to getting like a Swedish massage, they tell you, what is this? And I'm going to touch you like this and this. Are you comfortable or not? Is this okay? And I think this is if you're going to a hairdresser or getting other services where people are touching you or coming close to you. Of course, they have devised some ways to talk about this, and I think you can do the same in games. And I'm very interested in trying to explore also games that can become even sexual, because there's a lot of interesting things you can do with sexual intimacy and games that has not been explored at all. But of course, you then need to have consent and work with that, and being very explicit about what you are doing, and then of course also having a playful attitude, and where it's okay to step in and then step out again all the time.
There's so much here. I just want to mention a game anthology called Honey and Hot Wax. I'll put a link in the chat. When you mentioned games that have sexual content or that could lead to sex or are in that realm, this is a set of games written by people that are intended to be sexy, some of which sort of skirt that line. And this brings up a whole nother area of design and community BDSM and scene play, and there's a world of play there that has developed its own social mores and tools, and some of those have been adopted in LARP circles as communication tools, which is great. Red, yellow, green, I think is one of those tools in terms of calibrating. Do you want to stop? Is this good? Do you want to slow down? To be able to help people get a better sense of where everyone stands in an encounter, fictional encounter. So where does a designer stand? What's your responsibility is the question. There's a variety of different roles you have. One of them is what's the opportunity you're creating? What's the we talked about alibi. What's the mechanism and the space that you're making for people to have an experience together? And then within that, there's all kinds of levers and different expression of that. How much are you defining as the game designer? Are you making a very specific scenario that has tones and feelings associated with it? Are you even designing the space, perhaps, in some situations? Think of Disney, having this 360 control of amazing effects and whatnot, or in a very small way. There's a great game called 10 Candles that just uses darkness and a narrative of the apocalypse coming to really bring you into this feeling of loss. And then within that space, and the other variable is how much is it customized by the players? Are they creating the scenario? Are you giving them rules to create a scenario that then they play through? Are you giving them so much customization about the characters, about the setting, about the tone, about the space, about how they interact with one another? Are you giving them tools to calibrate, like the red, green, yellow? Are you giving them things that allow them to create ways that they are interacting? And that's a whole nother area. And then within that, what are their safety mechanisms, or what are their agreements that allow them to communicate if they need something to interrupt play or to change play so that they can feel more comfortable? And then many games often have things that are not on the table. These are certain things that we're going to not include in play to allow people to feel comfortable so that they can engage and not worry that they're gonna when they're having their picnic, walk across that line. So there's a lot of responsibility there, and also there's only so much one can do. The role-playing games particularly are so open. If you think about a chess set, where the pieces are and where they move, and so bringing in narrative and story and play really opens things up in a much different way. And I have a couple of examples from my game. Maybe I can just one, if it's all right if I talk on a little more. I'm getting close to the at top of the hour, but Under My Skin, which is the LARP of the 3 games that I wrote, there's a mechanic that I thought of a couple of times when Jacob was talking about that doesn't use dice, but it brings emotional intimacy and conflict into play in a very free-form way. The game is about a group of friends who know one another and then all of a sudden start sort of maybe feeling attracted to people that aren't their partner. And the culminating scene is, players who are in this situation are choosing, will they cross a line that their partner has set and do something a little bit more with this new exciting partner, or will they respect the lines of their original relationship? And there's no judgment necessarily. It's unique. Every situation is different. Every relationship that's in this game can play out in a lot of different ways. And the technique that I adapted was one of whispering in someone's ear to give them guidance. And so you have 2 people who are in a scene, both of whom might be deciding to cross a line on someone else. And you have 2 people at their shoulders playing the angel and the devil, sort of saying, yeah, go for it. Or no, this would really hurt them. And thinking about, again, design and how do you help people and how do you create structures that give people choice and buffer them or enable them. It's a rule in the game that the person playing the partner of someone who's in that situation chooses first whether they want to be one of those people on the shoulder and what role they want to take. And it's really fun when they take the devil role and they're like, yeah, go for it. But also it's fascinating seeing what they bring up, and the angel, think like, no, this is really important, and think of what you've built together. And so, or maybe they just want to watch it happen, or maybe they want to be from the, tempting the other person to do whatever. And it just gives people a lot of room to play and to think. And it's a very, very intense moment for everyone until like someone takes someone's hand and chooses which way they're going to go. So just wanted to offer that as an example of a mechanic.
It's a really good example, Emily. Thank you. And I'll let Kirsty speak to this point as well about I guess the role in your case for creating kind of intimacy for a reader, right? That's a really different thing to I guess game design, but maybe there's some interesting parallels.
It is, and I think I think so. You were talking there about, we've talked quite a bit about people being fearful, readers being fearful of coming across particular types of intimacy, or finding things a little bit cringy or embarrassing or awkward. And the good thing about romance is it's so, even the covers are just so heavily codified that you know what you're buying. They're so well marketed, and so you can tell just by looking at my covers that these are not going to have really, really explicit sex in them. But I think because they're written for a particular kind of British marketplace, I think we know there's going to be some sex in them. If there's a black and white photograph of a torso on the page, there's going to be sex in that book. And if there isn't, you'll be really disappointed. So we have these markers that tell us what to buy. They help us choose what we want to buy. And luckily, there are really clear heat ratings in romance publishing. So even looking at Mills and Boon's category romances, there's a sort of a scale of heat levels. So you know exactly what you're going to get. So if you buy something from the Dare line, you're going to get explicit sex. If you buy something from the Modern line, you're going to get some kisses maybe. So you know what you're getting. And I think readers are very, very canny at choosing what they want. And I think romance is getting better at content warnings as well. Yet I still think we've got a really long way to go. All my content warnings are on my website, but they're not in any other part of my book other than my author letter. So I put an author letter at the back of every story, and I keep asking my publishers if we can put it at the beginning of every book, because I put content warnings in the author letter. But if it's at the back, it's too late. You'll come across difficult content, and my books do deal with some of the things that we talked about earlier today. So my Summer at the Highland Coral Beach, which sounds absolutely dreamy and adorable and has a lovely pink cover, is actually about a woman trying to recover from a miscarriage and finding that she just can't get better because nobody will talk to her about her baby, and she's desperately unhappy. I mean, that doesn't sound like a romance, does it? But it is. And she finds comfort through talking. And that's a really important content warning to share, isn't it? I think romance is also becoming better, and this is just happening very recently in the last few years, as hopefully is happening across culture, about consent and about managing. What Hazel said earlier really struck a chord with me about how if the first time children are learning about consent is when they're doing sex ed stuff, then it's too late. And I think that's the same in a romance novel. I think if the first time your character says, can I do this, or is it okay if I do this, or do you want to do that? And the first time, if that's happening in the sex scene, then it's a bit too late. And I tend to write very tender characters and very gentle men, very sweet men who are extremely respectful and gentle. I mean, they're extremely hot as well, but they're very gentle and tender. And consent is important in everything we do. And consent checking the simplest of things, like the way we do with our friends and our family, just checking in. is important. And if the first time you see consent on the page is during a sex scene, then it's a bit late, in my opinion. So, and I also want to talk very quickly about sensitivity readers. More and more publishers are hiring sensitivity readers, and this was not a thing. 5 years ago, this was not a thing. People didn't do it. And Romance is really getting on board with this idea of sensitivity readers and try not to cause harm to the people we love. We love our readers, and we want people to have a really happy, safe experience. And content warnings and sensitivity readers are needed for that reason. I'm just going to give you a good example of somebody who's really, really bloody good at this. Rebecca Weatherspoon. If you haven't read Rebecca Weatherspoon's books, I urge you to. She wrote a beautiful book called Ralph about a male nanny, and he's just an absolute angel of a man. And she begins that book by saying, you are not going to be hurt in this experience. This reading experience is, she calls it fluff. And she says, you're going to be safe here. And she outlines any difficult content, but again, there's not much in there. And I think more romance readers are taking the Rebecca Weatherspoon direction and being kind to their readers. So there are no surprises. So, there you go.
Thank you so much. I'm really conscious we are at the top of the hour now, and there's so many fantastic questions in the chat, but I know we can't overrun because I know that Kirsty has
my babies are in after school club.
Oh, okay, well,
yeah.
Well, I also don't want to overrun because it's, you know, our schedule is our schedule and people have their own stuff going on, but I am just going to kind of just gloss on some of the things that have been mentioned in the chat, because I think the audience has brought up some really interesting points. I mean, we've got a really interesting point from Dina about again about fiction and games, or the relationship between the two. And he mentions the carrier bag theory of fiction by Ursula Le Guin, talking about the traditional narrative being action-based, having a hero who's obviously typically male, although not so much anymore, and that there's perhaps a direct kind of parallel there with games, right? Like fiction and games have kind of followed a similar evolution, perhaps. So that was a really good point. There's some really interesting point from Laura about players playing games as a form of submission, kind of giving up control. And perhaps, you know, there's a sort of giving oneself to the story or giving oneself to the game that is maybe an element of romance, playing romance games or reading romance novels. And then some really interesting chat about maybe the dark side of gamifying romance, and people been talking about the pickup artist. The foundational text for the kind of really toxic masculine pickup artist culture is called The Game, which is quite a disturbing point that someone's brought up there, very interesting. And loads of really good recommendations and comments about games and work that's been done on this topic. But there is, I'll ask one last question, I guess, which is, in what ways do the different forms of games and novels that we've been talking about, RPGs, board games, novels, how do they invite players or readers to identify with characters? Emily's work's got a really interesting moment, the switch in Breaking the Ice, where the real world players identify the differences between them in the real world, and then they apply those differences in the opposite direction to their characters. There's a real kind of interesting real world, game world continuum there that the game is encouraging you to play with. Fog of Love explicitly in the rules says that sometimes you're your character, but sometimes you're in kind of a godlike position where you're like directing the story. So yeah, what's that? I guess a final question about what's that role of like player, reader, character identification? Because it's really interesting and quite different in all the different things you've been discussing.
It's such a good question. So my experience, again, they always meet my game with this a bit of anxiety. and I've thought a lot about, okay, how can you, a lot of people who have not played role-playing games and don't know what it means to play a role and identify with the role and then go back and forth. Those people have tried and are expert role-playing gamers. They don't have a problem with this, but if you haven't tried this, of course, it's a completely new experience. I've thought a lot about, okay, can you actually design a game about romance and relationships where you don't identify. And one of the structural elements I've been playing with, but it's something I've currently, I'm not designing anything about this, but it's something I've thought a lot about. Is if instead of having 2 players play one character each, you have 2 players on one side playing like the subconscious and the more the rational side of one person, and the same for the other. So 2 players are playing one character. So like the angel and the demon on the shoulders, one is trying to achieve some goals, and the other one is trying to achieve some other goals, but with the same character. There you are clearly not playing the character. You're just playing aspects of a character and trying then to make the character do things that fit with your goals or your objectives. This, of course, creates a lot of hilarious situations because the character is doing stuff that is often suboptimal, and that's of course also what drives a good story. So it has been a very interesting experiment I've worked with. Something I want to do in the future, but yeah, this is one way to play with this and try to de-identify with the character, and it helps. It helps non-expert role-playing gamers actually play a role-playing game.
Cool, thank you. Emily, do you want to come in and talk a little bit about your switch here?
Sure. The game is called Breaking the Ice, so I thought, oh, let's include an icebreaker. And it was actually way more interesting and powerful in some ways than I had planned, because what I've invited people to do is to talk about themselves before they play a game with another person, which isn't really something you do when you play a game. Like you often like never talk about yourself. And it was kind of nice because the context I often ran it in was conventions. And so, it helped people just sort of talk to someone else. And then you had to like get through okay, so we're the same in a lot of ways. I'm a guy, you're a guy, we're white. You do computer programming too. Okay. So where are we different? What is different about our experience? And then the other piece too was that I wanted to make sure that it wasn't something that we were inviting people to accentuate or caricature someone else. It was really, you're giving this one tiny probably element of how anyone is and giving it to this character and creating a whole character that gets played. So you're not trying to pretend to be the person you're playing with, and you're really asking that other person to help you shepherd that difference that maybe you want to learn a little bit about. What was it like to grow up in England versus growing up in America, whatever it might be. And so you're opening yourself up, and you're also on even footing because you're both making a change like that. You're both opening yourself up to something different. And it's a 2-player game. It means nobody else is watching you. It's just this one other person that you're making this choice to be vulnerable with a little bit. So when I designed it, I actually ended up creating a lot of things that supported you being able to open up in this way. And it's a collaborative game. You're working together to see if these characters fall in love, and it's the dice that are like pushing back. And something that I thought of after Jake was talking was that there's something nice about game mechanics because it allows you to use different incentives to let people make choices they might not make, either in a narrative or what they would do. You can tempt them. In Breaking the Ice, the character, it's sort of one of the themes I pulled on was romantic comedy. So you try and make things go well, and then the dice say, it didn't. So now you have the opportunity to re-roll the dice by making things go wrong in the date. And so people are tempted to introduce awkward things that happen based on their characters' lives. And so we can use game mechanics to create the opportunity for people to choose things going wrong, or like Kirsty was talking about earlier with the characters apart at the end. We can have different ways of looking at the narrative so that we get that juicy romance, but also make them work for it a little bit, which makes it better in the end.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess identification, Kirsty, is going to work really differently. How do you see that in your work?
I mean, of course, I can really only speak to sort of contemporary mainstream rom-coms. I don't write genre mashups, and I tend not to read lots of fantasy romances or anything like that. So but in that particular market, I think for the last 20 years or so, there's been it's dominated by male-female romances, where with a likable talk about that likability, with a likable female character who we are supposed to, as readers, project ourselves onto. They're kind of a bit of a blank site we can identify with and go on a journey with. And I think there's a huge appetite for that still in readers. I still see reviews, thousands of them, all the time, for lots of romance novels saying, I really identified with that reader, with that character. I really liked her. Okay, but the problem with that is that it can be really excluding, and it shuts a lot of readers out. And romance is evolving and doing better at representing all kinds of lovers. I do have a lovely list that I'll be happy to email out to people with recommendations for romance. I can prove there's a romance for everyone. So let's not forget our ace friends and our arrow friends and our demisexual friends. There are novels for everybody where people find love and fulfillment. And they are slowly becoming more available, so that more readers can enjoy taking emotional risks in a safe environment in the world, if they're whatever romance novel they identify as being written for them. So I'll be happy to email that out to my long list, out to anybody who wants it.
Thank you so much. I will wrap the panel up there, and thank once again our panelists for their time, for sharing their wonderful work, and hopefully getting us all interested in playing some of these really cool romance games. So thank you very much, panelists, once again. And I'm going to, we'll wrap up the day now. Our day today is finishing now. I'm going to just share my screen very briefly, just so that my colleague Rob, who's running tomorrow's day on digital games, can just can tell us a little bit about what's happening tomorrow at Multi-Platform. So I'm going to hand over to Rob now. Thank you very much, everybody else, and thank you so much to our audience for joining us and for the really rich chat that we've had.
Thanks, Chloe. And yeah, thanks to all the speakers, really fantastically interesting panels. I'm more of a digital person, but that was really thought-provoking. And tomorrow we have a day addressing a lot of the same themes, corporeality, embodiment, but in relation to digital games, digital platforms, other forms of play. So it'd be great to see some of you there. We have panels talking about different kind of input technologies and how they read the body. We have panels analyzing representations and simulations of embodiment in games, and on streaming and esports. And we also have keynotes from Irene Fubara-Manuel and Zoanda Street, both of whom kind of research and make games, and from Susanna Parsonen, who has written a range of fantastic and fascinating things about digital media, sexuality and play. So the kickoff is, as you can see, slightly earlier than today's. We're looking to make a start at 9:30. But yeah, it'd be fantastic to see some of you there tomorrow.